Starting with the rear wheel here. It's just little hose clamps that holds these onto the exhaust. That's all that is. The rear one back here. But after you get the heat shields off, you scoot up here. You got two 13mm bolts on this rear cylinder, and then you got the same on the front cylinder. I already took those off. Then you got a little bolt that slides down right in there, and a nut on the other side. Scoot your eyes down. You got two little nuts that I already took off. One fancy nut right here. This exhaust just comes out. Exhaust is out of the way. Makes a lot more room, and it's a necessary part to begin getting to all of this componentry back here so we can get this rear tire off. Scoot over here to clutch side, pull off this belt guard. You just got a couple of bolts there and there, and it'll pop right off, just like that. And we got this little spring clip, and this is your axle nut. This will pop out. We'll take this out. You gotta pay attention. You got a spacer right in there, and you got another spacer right in there. We're gonna have to remove this caliper. Problem is, the caliper is held in by the axle bolts. So when you lower this thing down to the ground, that's when you take these two bolts out and you tie it up out of the way. But you can't do that before you take the axle bolt out on this one. You got to drop it all down together. Loosen the axle nut here, and then you just get a soft hammer and pound on that side. And while you're pounding on that side, you can wiggle this other side out, and it'll all just kind of drop on out of there. Well, fellas, that was fiddly. See, you pull this off of the drive gear there. While you're doing all of that, you got to slide this guy off of that little peg, but it's off. So now we're going to get the front one off here. A couple of bolts on the caliper there. Caliper will pull up and out of the way, and then I already loosened this so I can push that axle out, and it should just drop right out, no problem. Then on this side, you got the pinch bolt here, and the pinch bolt comes out. You got your nut and your washers back there. And then you can take that tool that you use to get the pinch bolt out, if it's long like this one, help you pull that axle out. And before you pull it all the way out, you're gonna have these little fender bolts that are 12mm. And you gotta take the fender off, otherwise the tire gets stuck on it. I already pulled my spacer out. This spacer went on the clutch side, and the smaller spacer went on the brake side of the bike. Here we are, ready to reinstall. Biggest trouble with this is gonna be to get the caliper kind of positioned so that we can slide everything in. So I'm gonna get it kind of up and on this little notch here and still leave it unhooked so it has some room to wiggle, and then slide that rear tire in and see if I can't just get it all to rest right in place. Before I do that rear tire install, I'm gonna get this axle good and cleaned up so I can re-grease it, get all the spacers cleaned up, the bolts and washers, so everything just looks proper. Got it mostly cleaned up, checked for big scoring or run out, and axle looked fine. So this is how it's all gonna go back together. Little spacer over here, big spacer over here on the bike, little spacer over there, big spacer over there on the belt side, and then your washer and your nut on the side over here, and then we've got that little lock pin, and I'll show you that at the end. I just use any old number 2 grease to grease things up here, and it should work just fine. This would have been way easier with 2 people. What I ended up doing is I held in this spacer with the front axle while I manipulated this side to get this spacer in, because there's just almost no room for error here. And then I decided I was tired of fighting with this caliper, so I just disconnected my brake line. Now I got to bleed those brakes, but that just means another video. But now this thing, the rear axle is all the way on. I just got to tighten it down and put that clip on. And I suppose it's worth mentioning 65 foot-pounds on this guy, but don't forget you also have to line up this little hole. And you can tell mine's not lined up. I'm gonna have to go a little further just so I can get that little pin in. I actually had to back mine off just a smidge and then re-torque it. Ended up with 61 foot-pounds, and I was able to line that up. I'd rather do 61 than what felt like I'd have to go to like 80, and that's just too much. I think the range is 60 to 65, so somewhere in there you'll be all right. After we've got that axle nut all tightened down, you can go ahead and put this belt cover on, and then we'll put the bottom cover on. You'll notice we have 2 different sizes here, a long one and a short one. The short one isn't long enough to go through the back here, and so we know the long one goes in the back because that's the only way we can do it. And that's all she wrote for the rear tire. Rear tire is installed. Now let's get the front wheel sorted. It's a really important thing to distinguish here. We went and brought this wheel to a proper shop that can true the wheel so it doesn't do this down the road. It actually balanced okay, but it wasn't trued. So they trued it up for us. That's just tightening the spokes to make sure the actual wheel itself is perfectly round. And then they did something else kind of cool. They went and put these weights on here, and they're called spoke weights, so that way you don't have anything ugly along the side of your rim. So that's just a nice little bit. Preparing for the install, all I did for the axle is clean it up real good, check it for scoring and run out, and then it's going to slide through. We're going to throw some grease on there to make sure everything stays nice and lubricated, and then bolt it all up, leave the fender off during this install, put the brakes back together, and go from there. We got everything slid through here, and here's an important bit. You've got the big spacer on the brake side, and you've got the little spacer on the non-brake side. But look here. We got a little bit of play in this fork. Now Harley tells you want to put the pinch bolt in first, and then you want to put in the nut to squeeze it together. So pinch bolt's going to go in first. That's going to hold our axle right where we want it to be. And then we are going to put in the nut, and that's going to hold everything together. And then we'll go in and clean a little bit of this grease right here just to make it all look nice. Pinch bolt torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. And then the axle nut torqued down to 51 foot-pounds. And so you get a little bit of this grease popping through. That's just because we over-greased a little bit. Not a big deal. We're just going to clean it up so it looks nice and fresh. Next up for me is putting this caliper back on. And we've got two sized bolts. Look at your caliper here, and you can clearly tell the long bolt is going to go into that top part. The short bolt is going to go into that bottom part. And this guy just slides right over the rotor like that. Put it into position and tighten everything down. These are about 35 foot-pounds on the torque spec for the mounting bolts here. Front tire is almost done. We just need to do the front fender here, and then we'll be done with the tire job on this thing. Of course, we still have a ton of work to do on this because we're doing a multi-series video on this Harley, but this is it for the tires. I hope you enjoyed. Fender's on. That's all she wrote.